The most dangerous man in a prison is usually not the loudest one. The heavy steel door rolled open with a deep metallic groan that echoed through the housing block. Conversations slowed. Heads turned. A few inmates glanced up from card games. Others looked over the railings of the second tier. New arrivals always attracted attention, but this one seemed different from the moment he stepped inside. Marcus Reed walked through the entrance carrying a small property bag in one hand. He was a black man in his early 50s, taller than average, with short gray hair and a calm expression that revealed almost nothing. He moved at an unhurried pace, neither intimidated nor impressed by his surroundings. The fluorescent lights above cast pale reflections across the polished concrete floor as he followed a correctional officer toward the center of the block. The room buzzed with the usual sounds of prison life. A television played in the background. Dominoes clicked against a metal table. Someone laughed near the phones. Yet despite all the noise, people kept watching Marcus. There was something unusual about him. Not because he looked tough. He did not. Not because he acted important. He did not. If anything, he seemed completely uninterested in drawing attention to himself. That alone made several inmates curious. Leaning against a railing on the second tier stood Travis Cole. Everyone in the block knew him. White, broad-shouldered, and always surrounded by followers, Travis had spent years building a reputation that depended on people noticing him. He enjoyed being the center of attention. He enjoyed testing newcomers even more. The moment he spotted Marcus, a grin appeared on his face. "Looks like retirement home sent us a transfer," he called out. A few inmates laughed. Others simply watched. Marcus did not respond. He continued walking exactly as before. Travis exchanged a look with one of his friends and laughed louder. "You hear me, old man," he shouted. "You planning on surviving your first week?" More laughter followed. Not everyone joined in. Some simply waited to see what the newcomer would do. Marcus finally stopped near a table positioned beneath the staircase. He set down his property bag and slowly looked around the housing unit. His eyes moved across the room with quiet precision. The television, the exits, the officer station, the stairwells, the upper tier. Then he looked toward Travis. For a brief moment, the entire block seemed to pause. People expected an argument, a comeback, some kind of reaction. Instead, Marcus gave a small nod, as if acknowledging a stranger in a grocery store, and then looked away. The response confused everyone. Travis frowned. The dismissal felt effortless. Not disrespectful, not fearful, simply indifferent. Several inmates exchanged glances. One older prisoner, sitting near the dayroom window, lowered his newspaper. Another stopped arranging dominoes. Neither said a word, but both noticed the same thing. Marcus had entered the block without carrying any visible tension. Most new arrivals arrived nervous, cautious, or eager to prove themselves. This man appeared none of those things. He looked comfortable. That was unusual. Travis was not ready to let the moment go. "Guess he forgot how conversations work," he called out. More laughter followed, though it sounded weaker this time. Marcus calmly picked up his assigned bedding and followed the officer toward his cell. He never increased his pace, never lowered his head, never showed irritation. As he disappeared down the tier, a strange feeling settled over the housing unit. The tough guy believed he had just mocked another easy target. Most people watching assumed the same thing. But a handful of inmates felt something else entirely. They could not explain it yet. They only knew that the quiet new arrival carried himself like a man who had already seen things far bigger than anything inside those walls. The evening count ended, and the housing unit slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Televisions flickered from opposite corners of the dayroom. Conversations drifted through the air in small clusters. Metal chairs scraped against the floor. Yet beneath the ordinary routine, something had changed. The arrival of Marcus Reed had given people a new subject to talk about. From the upper tier to the tables near the phones, inmates quietly exchanged observations. Most newcomers spent their first few hours trying to understand the rules of the block. Marcus seemed to understand something else entirely. He had entered the unit with the calm confidence of a man arriving at a place he had already studied. Sitting near the dayroom window, an older inmate named Leonard Hayes continued watching the second tier where Marcus's assigned cell was located. Leonard had spent more than 20 years moving through different correctional facilities. Experience had taught him to pay attention to details. Small details often revealed more than loud personalities ever could. Across from him sat another inmate named Victor Daniels, a former truck driver in his late 60s. Victor followed Leonard's gaze and lowered his voice. "You noticed it too, did you not?" Leonard nodded. "Everybody thinks they noticed the quiet part." Victor smiled faintly. "But that is not what caught your attention." Leonard folded his arms. "No, it was the way he looked at the room." Victor leaned forward. "Exactly." Neither man needed to explain further. They had both seen it. When Marcus first entered the housing unit, he had not looked overwhelmed. He had not stared at the inmates. He had not focused on the noise. Instead, his eyes had calmly moved from location to location, almost as if he were memorizing the environment. The exits, the stairwells, the officer station, the blind spots. The observation unsettled Leonard because it reminded him of people he had known long ago. People who remained calm because preparation had become second nature. Meanwhile, Travis Cole stood near the television area surrounded by several younger inmates. He continued making jokes about the new arrival, but the laughter felt different now, less enthusiastic, less certain. Earlier, everyone assumed Marcus would react eventually. Yet hours had passed, and nothing had changed. The new inmate had not complained, had not argued, had not attempted to impress anyone. The absence of a reaction was becoming more interesting than any reaction could have been. Travis noticed the shift immediately. He relied on attention the way some people relied on coffee. When the attention started drifting elsewhere, he felt it. "You all acting like he is some kind of celebrity," Travis said. One of the younger inmates shrugged. "Nobody said that." Travis frowned. "Then why is everyone talking about him?" The question lingered unanswered. Because the truth was simple. Nobody actually knew who Marcus Reed was. Curiosity filled the empty space where information should have been. Up on the second tier, Marcus finished organizing the few personal items he had been allowed to bring with him. The cell was small, clean, and nearly identical to every other cell in the unit. He placed a paperback book on the narrow shelf beside his bunk and sat quietly for a moment. Through the bars, he could see most of the housing block below. Inmates moving between tables. Officers conducting routine checks. The glow of television screens reflecting against polished floors. He observed everything with patient attention. Then he opened the book and began reading. Several inmates noticed. That detail surprised them more than anything else. A man who had spent his first afternoon being talked about by the entire block seemed completely uninterested in the attention. Down below, Leonard continued watching. Finally, he shook his head and smiled. "Whatever his story is," he said softly, "it is bigger than this place." Victor looked toward the second tier and nodded. For reasons neither man could fully explain, they were beginning to believe exactly the same thing. By the following morning, the housing unit had developed a new routine. Every time Marcus Reed entered a room, conversations seemed to pause for a fraction of a second before continuing. It was subtle enough that most people would not notice it, but inside a prison, small details carried meaning. Breakfast trays rattled across metal tables as inmates filtered into the dining area. Steam rose from paper cups of coffee. The smell of toast and powdered eggs filled the air. Yet despite the familiar routine, curiosity continued spreading through the block. Nobody knew much about the new arrival. That absence of information had become its own form of mystery. Marcus sat alone near one of the windows and quietly ate breakfast while sunlight filtered through reinforced glass and stretched across the floor. He never looked rushed, never appeared distracted. Even something as simple as drinking coffee seemed deliberate. Across the room, Travis Cole noticed people glancing toward the newcomer. The attention irritated him more than he wanted to admit. Normally, new inmates spent their first days trying to gain acceptance or avoid trouble. Marcus appeared interested in neither. That made him difficult to understand and even harder to control. Travis leaned back in his chair and watched him from a distance. "I still do not get it," one of his friends said quietly. "Get what?" Travis asked. "Him." The younger inmate nodded toward Marcus. "Everybody keeps talking about him." Travis scoffed. "People get bored around here. That is all." Yet even as he said the words, he did not fully believe them. Something about Marcus felt different. Not intimidating. Not threatening. Different. Near the far wall, Leonard Hayes and Victor Daniels continued their own observations. The two older inmates had seen countless newcomers over the years. They understood how fear looked. They understood how confidence looked. What puzzled them was that Marcus seemed to exist outside both categories. He neither projected strength nor avoided attention. He simply moved through the environment as if he had already accepted every possible outcome. "You know what bothers me?" Victor said. Leonard looked up from his tray. "What?" Victor lowered his voice. "He never watches people watching him." Leonard paused. The observation landed immediately. Victor was right. Most inmates constantly monitored the reactions around them. Marcus did not. He remained focused on whatever task sat in front of him. Reading, eating, walking, listening. It was a strange quality, and the more they noticed it, the stranger it became. Across the dining hall, a correctional officer named Sergeant Miller reviewed paperwork while occasionally glancing toward the inmate population. When Marcus entered the room earlier that morning, Miller had instinctively looked up. Something about the man seemed familiar, though he could not explain why. It was not his face. It was not his age. It was the way he carried himself. The way he entered a room and immediately understood its rhythm. The thought lingered in Miller's mind even after he returned to his paperwork. Back at the table near the window, Marcus finished breakfast and calmly folded a napkin beside his tray. He briefly looked out at the prison yard where morning sunlight illuminated chain-link fences and empty walkways. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought. Then he stood and carried his tray toward the return station. Several inmates watched him pass. Nobody could explain why. The mystery surrounding him had only deepened. Some believed he had spent years in prison before arriving here. Others thought he might have held an important position somewhere outside. A few simply believed he was unusually disciplined. None of them possessed enough information to know the truth. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The man everyone assumed was just another inmate carried himself like someone who had already lived through experiences far beyond anything anyone inside that housing unit could imagine. If someone had asked who controlled the housing unit, almost every inmate would have given the same answer. Travis Cole. His influence could be felt everywhere, from the television area to the recreation yard. He had spent years building a reputation that reached far beyond simple popularity. New arrivals learned his name within hours. Long-term inmates adjusted their routines around him. Even people who disliked him understood that ignoring his presence was rarely an option. That reputation had not appeared overnight. Travis understood prison culture better than most men his age. He knew how rumors spread. He knew how attention worked. Most importantly, he knew how to place himself at the center of every conversation. During mealtimes, he occupied the best tables. During recreation periods, he surrounded himself with people eager to earn his approval. Wherever groups formed, Travis somehow became the loudest voice among them. On the surface, confidence seemed to radiate from him. Yet beneath that confidence existed something else. A constant need to maintain the image he had created. The housing unit functioned according to invisible rules. Respect mattered. Reputation mattered. Perception mattered even more. Travis had spent years carefully shaping all three. That was why Marcus Reed bothered him. The new inmate had arrived carrying none of the usual concerns. He had not tried to impress anyone. He had not tried to avoid attention. He had not asked questions about alliances, rivalries, or bloc politics. It was as if the entire social structure surrounding him simply did not matter. That indifference created a problem Travis could not easily solve. Late that afternoon, sunlight filtered through narrow windows and cast long shadows across the dayroom floor. Groups of inmates gathered around card tables while others watched television. Travis sat in his usual spot near the center of the room. Several younger inmates listened as he told stories from previous years inside the system. Normally the group would have hung on every word. Today felt different. More than once, he noticed people glancing toward the second tier, toward Marcus. The observation irritated him. He stopped speaking in the middle of a sentence and looked across the room. There sat Marcus Reed, reading quietly beneath the glow of fluorescent lights. The older man appeared completely disconnected from the attention surrounding him. Travis frowned. "I do not understand what everyone finds so interesting," he said. One of the younger inmates shrugged. "Maybe because nobody knows anything about him." Another nodded. "Yeah, he is different." Travis leaned back in his chair. Different. The word echoed in his mind. He disliked mysteries. Mysteries created uncertainty. Uncertainty weakened control. Across the room, Leonard Hayes watched the exchange unfold. He had seen powerful personalities come and go throughout the years. The strongest ones usually shared a common trait. They depended on recognition from other people. The moment that recognition began shifting elsewhere, cracks appeared. Leonard suspected he was watching the beginning of one of those moments. Up on the second tier, Marcus turned a page in his book. He seemed unaware that half the housing unit was discussing him. Or perhaps he was aware and simply did not care. That possibility fascinated Leonard even more. Evening approached. The sounds of the housing block continued echoing through concrete walls. Televisions played. Conversations rose and fell. Officers conducted routine rounds. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of prison life, a subtle change continued taking shape. For the first time in a long time, Travis Cole was no longer the most interesting person in the room. And the man quietly replacing him had not said more than a handful of words since arriving. By the third day, Marcus Reed had become the most discussed person in the housing unit without making any effort to be noticed. That fact alone puzzled nearly everyone. Most inmates earned attention through stories, arguments, alliances, or reputation. Marcus had earned it through silence. The mystery surrounding him continued growing with every passing hour. Early that morning, the housing unit woke to the familiar sounds of prison routine. Cell doors opened electronically with a loud mechanical buzz. Officers called out instructions. Inmates shuffled toward breakfast carrying towels and coffee cups. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and fresh toast. Marcus stepped out of his cell and joined the flow of movement toward the dining hall. He walked at the same steady pace he always used. Not fast, not slow, just controlled. Several inmates noticed him immediately. They always did now. Leonard Hayes watched from the lower tier and quietly shook his head. "Look at that," he said to Victor Daniels. Victor glanced over. "What now?" Leonard pointed subtly toward Marcus. 3 days here and half the block watches him every time he enters a room. Victor smiled. "Maybe they are trying to figure him out." Leonard nodded. "Good luck with that." Down in the dining hall, Marcus selected his breakfast tray and sat near a window overlooking the recreation yard. The morning sunlight reflected across the glass, creating bright patterns on the floor. Around him, conversations continued, but his presence seemed to draw occasional glances from every corner of the room. Most inmates could not explain why they kept looking. Something about him felt familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. He did not resemble a man trying to survive prison. He looked more like a man studying a temporary assignment. Across the room, Travis Cole entered with several followers trailing behind him. Normally, people paid attention the moment he arrived. Today was different. A few heads turned, but many quickly returned their focus elsewhere. Travis noticed immediately. He noticed everything related to attention. As he moved through the cafeteria, he saw several inmates watching Marcus instead of him. The realization irritated him more than he cared to admit. He grabbed his tray and sat down heavily. "I still do not understand what everyone sees in that guy," he muttered. One of his friends shrugged. "Maybe because nobody knows anything about him." Travis frowned. That does not make him interesting. Yet even as he spoke, he found himself looking across the room toward Marcus again. Curiosity had become impossible to avoid. Near the officer station, Sergeant Miller reviewed paperwork while observing the dining area. The older officer had worked in corrections for nearly 25 years. During that time, he had developed an instinct for reading people. Marcus triggered that instinct repeatedly. There was something unusual about the man. Not dangerous, not aggressive, unusual. Miller had begun paying closer attention. He noticed how Marcus listened more than he spoke. He noticed how Marcus rarely positioned himself with his back to a room. He noticed how Marcus seemed aware of everything happening around him without appearing distracted. Small details, yet together they formed a pattern. Back at the window table, Marcus finished breakfast and folded his napkin neatly beside his tray. Then he sat quietly for another minute, watching sunlight spread across the prison yard. The scene looked peaceful despite the fences, towers, and concrete walls. For a brief moment, he seemed lost in thought. A younger inmate nearby finally gathered enough courage to approach him. "Can I ask you something?" Marcus looked up and smiled politely. "Sure." The younger man hesitated. "What did you do before coming here?" For the first time since arriving, Marcus paused noticeably before answering. His eyes drifted toward the window, toward the horizon beyond the prison fences. Then he smiled faintly. "A lot of traveling," he said. The answer only deepened the mystery. And as the young inmate walked away more curious than before, one thing became increasingly clear. Whatever story Marcus Reed carried with him, It stretched far beyond the walls of the prison that now surrounded him. Later that afternoon, while most inmates attended scheduled programs and recreation periods, Sergeant Miller sat alone inside a small administrative office reviewing transfer paperwork. A portable fan hummed softly from the corner of the room. Sunlight filtered through narrow blinds and stretched across stacks of folders covering his desk. Normally, inmate files were routine. Names, dates, medical notes, housing assignments. Nothing memorable. Yet for reasons he could not fully explain, he found himself pulling Marcus Reed's transfer packet from the stack once again. The feeling had lingered since the day Marcus arrived. Something about the man seemed familiar, not personally familiar, but familiar in the way certain habits or behaviors trigger old memories. Miller opened the folder and slowly reviewed the pages. Standard intake information appeared first. Age, transfer history, administrative notes. Nothing unusual. Then he reached a section containing supplemental documents attached by another facility. Miller paused. A brief notation had been highlighted near the bottom of a page. He leaned closer. The note itself revealed very little, but it referenced specialized training and prior service records that were not included in the transfer packet. Miller frowned. In nearly 25 years working corrections, he had rarely seen similar language attached to an inmate profile. The wording was vague, almost intentionally vague. Yet it was enough to confirm something he had already suspected. Marcus Reed possessed a background far different from what most people assumed. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the housing unit, the mystery surrounding Marcus continued growing. During recreation, several inmates watched him from a distance as he walked laps around the indoor track. His pace never changed. His posture never changed. Even his breathing seemed measured. Leonard Hayes noticed it immediately. "There it is again," he said quietly. Victor Daniels looked over. "What?" Leonard nodded toward Marcus. "Everything he does has purpose." Victor studied the older man carefully. The observation was difficult to argue with. Marcus never appeared rushed, never appeared distracted. Every movement seemed economical, as though years of practice had taught him not to waste energy. Across the gymnasium floor, Travis Cole noticed the same thing. Unfortunately for him, noticing only increased his frustration. Curiosity surrounding Marcus had reached a level he could no longer ignore. Every conversation somehow drifted back toward the newcomer. Every rumor centered on the same question. Who was Marcus Reed? Travis hated unanswered questions, especially when they involved someone drawing attention away from him. He bounced a basketball against the floor and glanced toward Marcus again. The older inmate continued walking, completely unaware of the attention surrounding him. Or perhaps aware and unconcerned. That possibility bothered Travis even more. Back inside the administrative office, Sergeant Miller closed the file and leaned back in his chair. The supplemental notation remained fresh in his mind. He still lacked the full picture, but one thing had become clear. Marcus was not simply an older inmate with unusual discipline. There was history behind that discipline. Experience. Training. Years spent developing habits that most people never acquire. Miller looked toward the office window overlooking part of the recreation yard. Through the glass, he could see Marcus walking beneath the afternoon sun. Calm, focused, unremarkable at first glance, yet somehow impossible to overlook. The realization stayed with him long after he returned the file to the cabinet. Out in the housing unit, rumors would continue spreading. Questions would continue multiplying. And somewhere beneath those questions sat an answer that nobody had discovered yet. An answer hidden inside a past far larger than anyone in the prison currently understood. Over the next several days, curiosity about Marcus Reed continued spreading through the housing unit like a rumor nobody could fully explain. Every shift change seemed to bring a new theory. Every meal introduced a new version of his past. Some inmates claimed he had once owned a successful business. Others insisted he had worked overseas. A few believed he had spent years traveling through places most people only saw on television. None of the stories matched, yet all of them shared one common detail. Nobody believed Marcus was ordinary anymore. That growing fascination only increased Travis Cole's frustration. On a warm afternoon during recreation, groups of inmates gathered around tables scattered across the yard. Some played cards. Others walked laps beneath a clear blue sky. The distant sound of traffic occasionally drifted over the perimeter walls. Travis sat with several followers near a shaded area, and watched Marcus from across the yard. Once again, the older man seemed perfectly comfortable being alone. He sat on a bench with a paperback book resting in his hands while sunlight filtered through nearby trees. Most people in prison looked for ways to pass the time. Marcus looked as though he had mastered the skill years ago. "You know what bothers me?" Travis finally asked. Nobody answered immediately. "He acts like none of this matters." One of the younger inmates shrugged. "Maybe it does not." Travis looked at him sharply. "Everything matters in here." Yet even as he spoke, uncertainty lingered beneath the words. Across the yard, another inmate had been watching Marcus for reasons entirely different. His name was Daniel Mercer, a former Marine who rarely discussed his military background. Daniel spent most of his time avoiding unnecessary conversations. Years of experience had taught him that listening revealed more than speaking. For several days he had quietly observed Marcus. The way he walked, the way he positioned himself in crowded areas, the way he constantly seemed aware of his surroundings without appearing nervous. None of those details proved anything. Yet together they formed a pattern Daniel recognized. He watched Marcus stand from the bench and begin walking toward the track. The movement immediately caught his attention. Every step appeared balanced, efficient, controlled, nothing wasted. Daniel slowly shook his head. "No way," he muttered under his breath. Nearby, Leonard Hayes overheard him. "What?" Daniel hesitated before answering. "Maybe nothing." Leonard waited. Daniel glanced toward Marcus again. "Or maybe something." The response only deepened the mystery. Later that evening, the housing unit buzzed with speculation once again. Word spread that Daniel Mercer had noticed something unusual about the newcomer. Nobody knew what it was. Nobody knew what it meant. Yet the rumor traveled from table to table within hours. Marcus remained unaware of the conversations surrounding him, or at least he appeared unaware. He spent part of the evening reading near the dayroom window while the glow of sunset painted long shadows across the floor. Around him, televisions played. Inmates laughed. Officers completed routine rounds. Yet Marcus seemed detached from the constant noise. Not disconnected, simply comfortable, as if silence existed even inside crowded rooms. Daniel watched him from across the dayroom. The longer he observed, the more convinced he became that his instincts were correct. He still lacked proof. He still lacked details. But experience told him something important. The habits Marcus displayed were not accidental. They had been developed somewhere. Refined somewhere. Earned somewhere. The question was where. And for the first time since Marcus arrived, someone inside the housing unit had begun moving closer to the answer. The following afternoon, the rumors surrounding Marcus Reed reached a level that could no longer be ignored. What began as quiet curiosity had evolved into something larger. Inmates who had never spoken to him were now discussing him. Officers who normally paid little attention to individual personalities had started noticing him. Even people who claimed not to care found themselves watching whenever he entered a room. The mystery had become part of the housing unit itself. During recreation, Daniel Mercer sat alone near the edge of the indoor gym, observing the steady flow of movement around him. Basketballs bounced against polished wood. Sneakers squeaked across the floor. Conversations echoed beneath the high ceiling. Yet Daniel's attention remained fixed on Marcus. The older man was walking slow laps around the perimeter of the gymnasium. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. Yet every step confirmed what Daniel had been suspecting for days. Finally, Leonard Hayes approached and sat beside him. "You have been studying him like a puzzle," Leonard said. Daniel smiled faintly. "Maybe because he is one." Leonard nodded toward Marcus. "What do you see?" Daniel remained silent for several seconds. "Awareness," he finally said. "Most people notice what is directly in front of them. He notices everything." Leonard looked across the gym. Marcus continued walking, seemingly lost in thought. "You really think it means something?" Daniel laughed quietly. "I know it means something. I just do not know what yet." Across the room, Travis Cole had begun noticing these conversations. More importantly, he had begun noticing who was having them. Men who rarely agreed on anything seemed strangely united when discussing Marcus. The realization bothered him. He had spent years becoming the person everyone watched. Now people seemed more interested in a man who barely spoke. That afternoon, Travis finally decided to approach him directly. The opportunity came near the water station. Marcus had just finished another lap around the gym and stopped for a drink. Travis walked over with two younger inmates following behind him. Several people immediately noticed. Conversations softened. Heads turned. Marcus placed the paper cup in a trash container and looked toward Travis with the same calm expression he always carried. "You know," Travis said, "for somebody who says almost nothing, you sure get people talking." Marcus smiled slightly. People usually talk when they do not have answers. The response surprised everyone nearby. Not because it was aggressive, because it was thoughtful. Travis appeared caught off guard for a brief moment. Then he laughed. "And what exactly are they trying to answer?" Marcus glanced around the gymnasium. "That depends on the question." Several inmates exchanged looks. Once again, Marcus had responded without giving anyone what they expected. Yet somehow the answer felt meaningful. Travis shook his head and walked away, clearly frustrated. Behind him, the younger inmates followed in silence. For the first time since Marcus arrived, it seemed as though Travis was the one searching for footing. Daniel watched the entire exchange from across the room. The conversation itself interested him less than Marcus's behavior during it. Calm breathing, relaxed posture, constant awareness. The same details kept repeating. The same clues kept appearing. Piece by piece, the puzzle was beginning to form. Later that evening, as inmates gathered in the day room beneath the glow of fluorescent lights, Daniel found himself replaying the moment again. The answer remained just beyond reach. But for the first time, he felt certain of one thing. Marcus Reed was not simply a disciplined man with an unusual past. He was someone who had spent years operating in environments where observation mattered more than words. And sooner or later, the truth behind that realization was going to surface for everyone to see. The next morning, the housing unit felt different in a way nobody could fully explain. Rumors had always moved quickly through the prison, but now they seemed to follow Marcus Reed wherever he went. By breakfast, conversations about him could be heard at nearly every table. Some inmates believed he had worked in government. Others claimed he had spent years overseas. A few insisted he must have held some kind of leadership position long before arriving at the facility. None of the theories matched, yet they continued spreading because every new observation seemed to create more questions instead of answers. Marcus sat at his usual table near the window, quietly drinking coffee while sunlight filtered through reinforced glass. Outside, a cool breeze moved across the recreation yard. Inside, dozens of inmates carried trays between tables while correctional officers monitored the room. The environment was busy, but Marcus appeared completely unaffected by it. Across the cafeteria, Daniel Mercer watched him carefully. The former Marine had spent days studying details most people overlooked. The way Marcus entered a room. The way he positioned himself during conversations. The way his attention seemed to extend far beyond whatever was directly in front of him. Daniel had reached a conclusion he could no longer ignore. During a break between meal periods, he approached Leonard Hayes near the beverage station. "I finally figured out what has been bothering me," Daniel said quietly. Leonard raised an eyebrow. "And?" Daniel glanced across the room, toward Marcus. "He moves like someone who spent years relying on preparation." Leonard folded his arms. "Military." Daniel hesitated. Maybe something even more specialized." The words immediately captured Leonard's attention. Before he could ask another question, a correctional officer called inmates to begin clearing tables. Yet the conversation stayed with him. By lunchtime, fragments of it had already started spreading through the housing unit. The effect was immediate. Curiosity became fascination. People who had previously viewed Marcus as merely unusual now began wondering whether there was a much larger story hidden beneath the surface. Travis Cole noticed the change right away. More than that, he disliked it. The rumors were no longer harmless speculation. They were beginning to elevate Marcus into something he could not define. Throughout the afternoon, Travis repeatedly caught people discussing the newcomer. Each conversation seemed to end with the same question. Who exactly was Marcus Reed? Late that day, the housing unit gathered in the day room during a scheduled quiet period. Televisions played softly. Some inmates read books while others worked on puzzles or wrote letters home. Marcus sat near the window with a paperback resting in his hands. The scene appeared ordinary. Then something happened that caught Daniel's attention. A sudden mechanical alarm sounded briefly from another section of the facility. Most inmates reacted instantly by turning toward the noise. Marcus reacted too, but differently. Before the sound had fully echoed through the room, his eyes had already identified the direction, the nearest exits, and the officer response. The entire sequence lasted less than a second. To almost everyone else, it went unnoticed. Daniel saw it clearly. His expression changed immediately. That was the moment his remaining doubts disappeared. He did not know Marcus's exact background. He did not know where the training came from. But he knew training when he saw it. Years of it. Decades, perhaps. Across the room, Marcus calmly returned to reading as if nothing had happened. The brief alarm was quickly explained as a routine maintenance issue, and normal activity resumed. Yet Daniel continued staring toward the window. The mystery that had consumed the housing unit was finally beginning to take shape. For the first time, someone inside the prison felt close to understanding the truth. And once that truth surfaced, the way people viewed Marcus Reed would never be the same again. By the end of the week, the mystery surrounding Marcus Reed had become impossible to separate from daily life inside the housing unit. Every conversation seemed to circle back to him eventually. The theories had become more detailed. Some inmates now spoke with complete confidence about things they could not possibly know. Others insisted they had finally figured out his past. Yet every explanation fell apart the moment Marcus appeared and quietly carried on with his day. Late that afternoon, a gray sky settled over the prison grounds as inmates returned from scheduled activities. The housing unit filled with the familiar sounds of evening routine. Televisions flickered. Card games resumed. Officers completed rounds. Marcus sat near the dayroom window reading as he often did, seemingly unaware that half the room continued studying him. Across the floor, Travis Cole watched with growing frustration. The situation had slipped further from his control than he wanted to admit. Every attempt to dismiss Marcus seemed to produce the opposite result. The quieter the older man remained, the more attention he attracted. Finally, Travis stood and crossed the room. Conversations softened almost immediately. People sensed something important was about to happen. Marcus looked up from his book as Travis approached. For a few seconds, neither man spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Rain began tapping lightly against the reinforced windows. Around them, inmates pretended not to watch while watching very carefully. Travis folded his arms. You know, most people would have told everyone who they are by now. Marcus closed his book and placed it beside him. Maybe. The answer sounded calm, almost thoughtful. Travis shook his head. You enjoy this, do not you? Marcus looked genuinely confused. Enjoy what? All the attention. Several inmates exchanged glances. They knew the answer before Marcus even spoke. He glanced around the room. Most of the attention is happening without me. A few quiet laughs spread through the dayroom. Even Travis seemed caught off guard. Once again, Marcus had answered without arguing, without challenging anyone, without trying to win. Yet somehow the response carried more weight than a confrontation ever could. Travis looked away briefly, then back toward him. People keep talking about you because they think you are hiding something. Marcus nodded slowly. Everyone is hiding something. The room became unusually quiet. The statement felt different from the others. Older, wiser, as though it came from years of experience rather than a clever conversation. Daniel Mercer watched from across the room and felt the same certainty he had felt for days. Marcus spoke like a man who had already learned lessons most people spend their entire lives chasing. Leonard Hayes noticed it too. The words themselves were simple. The confidence behind them was not. Travis stared at Marcus for a moment longer. Then, for reasons he could not fully explain, some of the frustration seemed to leave his face. He looked less like a man confronting a rival and more like someone trying to solve a puzzle. Marcus picked up his book again. Before opening it, he looked toward Travis one final time. You do not have to figure everything out today, he said. The statement was delivered with complete sincerity, not as a warning, not as an insult, as advice. Travis did not respond. He simply stood there for a second before turning and walking away. Around the room, conversations slowly resumed. Yet the atmosphere had changed once again. For the first time since Marcus arrived, people sensed they were approaching the truth. The clues were no longer random. The pieces were beginning to fit together. And somewhere beyond the rumors, beyond the speculation, beyond the mystery that had consumed the housing unit, a much larger story was waiting to be revealed. 2 days later, the moment that changed everything arrived without warning. It began during an ordinary afternoon program inside one of the larger activity buildings. Inmates sat at tables working on assignments while staff members moved between rows offering assistance. The atmosphere was quiet and routine. Then a sudden electrical problem caused several sections of the building to lose power. The room instantly darkened. Emergency lights activated a second later, casting the area in a dim red glow. Most people froze in surprise. A few looked around uncertainly. Several began talking at once. Staff members moved quickly to assess the situation, but confusion spread through the room before clear instructions could be given. Marcus Reed reacted differently. He did not panic. He did not rush. He simply stood, calmly observed the environment, and immediately identified the safest paths through the room. To most people, his actions appeared ordinary. To Daniel Mercer, they were anything but ordinary. Marcus was already evaluating exits, staff locations, and movement patterns before anyone else seemed to process what had happened. It was the kind of awareness Daniel had only seen in highly trained professionals. Nearby, a correctional officer attempted to organize the group while waiting for updates from maintenance staff. The officer remained composed, but the unexpected situation had created uncertainty. Marcus quietly helped guide several confused inmates toward the appropriate area without giving orders or drawing attention to himself. His voice remained calm. His movements remained controlled. Within minutes, the atmosphere began stabilizing. People naturally followed his example. They lowered their voices. They focused on instructions. The tension that had briefly filled the room started fading. Daniel watched everything unfold with growing certainty. Across the building, Travis Cole noticed it too. For the first time since Marcus arrived, he was not looking at him as a curiosity. He was looking at him as someone who clearly possessed experience that could not be explained by ordinary prison life. What stood out most was not what Marcus did. It was how naturally he did it. There was no hesitation, no confusion, no search for approval. Every decision appeared automatic, as though he had spent years operating in situations where staying calm mattered more than anything else. Within 20 minutes, maintenance staff restored power and normal operations resumed. The emergency lights switched off. Conversations slowly returned. Yet something had changed. People who witnessed the incident could not stop talking about it afterward. Back inside the housing unit that evening, the story spread quickly. Inmates described how Marcus seemed prepared before anyone else. How he remained calm while others looked around for answers. How staff members themselves appeared impressed by his composure. Leonard Hayes listened carefully as different versions circulated through the dayroom. Each retelling added another piece to the puzzle. Daniel sat nearby and finally allowed himself a small smile. He no longer wondered whether Marcus possessed a highly unusual background. He knew it. The only remaining question was what that background actually was. Across the room, Travis remained unusually quiet. He replayed the afternoon in his mind again and again. The more he thought about it, the more one uncomfortable realization returned. Marcus Reed had never been trying to prove himself. He never needed to. Whatever experiences shaped him had done that long before he ever stepped inside the prison. And as evenings settled over the housing unit, more people than ever before began to suspect that the truth behind Marcus's past was far greater than any rumor currently circulating through the block. The answer finally emerged in the most ordinary way imaginable. Not through a dramatic confession. Not through a confrontation. It surfaced because curiosity had grown too large to ignore. The morning after the power incident, Sergeant Miller sat inside the administrative office reviewing documentation connected to several inmate transfers. Rain tapped softly against the window. A half-finished cup of coffee rested beside a stack of folders. As he worked through paperwork, his attention returned once again to Marcus Reed's file. The questions surrounding the older inmate had reached even the staff. Miller knew enough to respect privacy and procedure, but he also knew that certain details explained behavior. And Marcus's behavior had become impossible to overlook. He opened the supplemental records attached to the transfer packet and carefully reviewed sections he had previously skimmed. This time he noticed a series of references that connected together like pieces of a puzzle. Specialized assignments, advanced training certifications, commendations, leadership evaluations. None of the documents used dramatic language. They did not need to. The facts spoke for themselves. Miller slowly leaned back in his chair. For several seconds, he simply stared at the paperwork. The mystery that had consumed the housing unit suddenly made perfect sense. Across the prison, normal activities continued. Inmates attended programs. Officers completed rounds. Marcus Reed spent part of the morning reading near the dayroom window. He appeared exactly as he always had. Calm, quiet, unremarkable at first glance. Yet the truth hidden behind that appearance was extraordinary. Word began spreading quietly among a small number of staff members who reviewed the documentation. Most remained professional and discreet. Even so, information has a way of moving through institutions. Small fragments reached trusted ears. Those fragments eventually reached Daniel Mercer. The former Marine was sitting in the library when a staff member he respected mentioned something in passing. Daniel listened carefully. Then his eyes widened. For the first time since Marcus arrived, the puzzle pieces aligned completely. Later that afternoon, Daniel sat across from Leonard Hayes in the dayroom. The older inmate immediately noticed the expression on his face. "You found something, did not you?" Daniel nodded slowly. "Not something. Everything." Leonard leaned forward. "Well," Daniel lowered his voice. "Marcus was Special Forces." The words seemed to stop the room around them. Leonard blinked. "You are sure?" Daniel nodded. "More than sure." For several seconds, neither man spoke. Suddenly, every observation from the previous weeks made sense. The awareness, the discipline, the calm reactions, the controlled movements, the ability to remain composed under pressure. None of it had been accidental. None of it had been an act. Marcus Reed had spent years operating at a level of responsibility and preparation that few people could fully understand. As the information quietly circulated through the housing unit, reactions varied. Some inmates seemed shocked. Others simply nodded, as though the revelation confirmed what they already suspected. A few sat silently, replaying every interaction they had ever had with him. Across the dayroom, Travis Cole listened as fragments of the story reached his table. At first he dismissed them. Then more details surfaced. Then more. Eventually, even he stopped arguing. The realization settled over him slowly. The man he had spent weeks mocking was not merely an older inmate with unusual confidence. He was someone whose life experience extended far beyond anything Travis had imagined. Meanwhile, Marcus remained completely unchanged. He sat near the window reading a book while afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor. People glanced toward him differently now. The mystery was gone. The answer had finally arrived. Yet what impressed everyone most was not who Marcus had been. It was the fact that he had never used that history to elevate himself above anyone else. He carried extraordinary experience with complete humility. And in a prison where reputation meant everything, that quality earned a level of respect no rumor ever could. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere inside the housing unit continued to change in ways nobody would have believed when Marcus Reed first walked through the steel doors carrying a small property bag. The rumors eventually faded because rumors were no longer necessary. People finally understood who he was. More importantly, they understood who he was not. He was not a man chasing attention. He was not interested in status. He was not trying to dominate conversations or build a reputation. The respect he received came naturally because it was never requested. Each day, he followed the same routine. He attended programs, read books, exercised during recreation periods, spoke politely with staff and inmates alike. Yet the effect he had on the people around him became impossible to ignore. Younger inmates began approaching him with questions about discipline, patience, and decision-making. Marcus never presented himself as a teacher. He simply answered honestly. Sometimes the answers were only a few words long. Other times they became quiet conversations that lasted several minutes. Either way, people listened. Leonard Hayes noticed the difference first. Then Victor Daniels noticed it. Even Sergeant Miller observed changes among inmates who normally struggled to focus. Somehow Marcus had become an example without ever trying to become one. Across the housing unit, Travis Cole experienced a different kind of change. The discovery of Marcus's past forced him to confront something uncomfortable. For years he had judged people based on appearances, reactions, and first impressions. Marcus had shattered every one of those assumptions. The man he dismissed as an ordinary newcomer had spent years developing qualities Travis himself admired but rarely understood. One afternoon, near the dayroom window, Travis approached Marcus while he was reading. Sunlight streamed across the floor. The housing unit buzzed with its usual activity. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Travis nodded toward the book. "I guess I got you wrong." Marcus looked up. His expression remained calm, exactly as it had been on the first day. "A lot of people did." Travis gave a small laugh. You could have told everyone who you were from the beginning. Marcus closed the book and looked out the window. Why? Travis considered the question, but found no answer. Marcus smiled faintly. If people only respect you because of your past, they are not really respecting you. The words stayed with Travis long after the conversation ended. In many ways, they stayed with the entire housing unit. Months later, new inmates would still hear stories about the quiet older man who arrived without announcing himself. They would hear about the mystery that surrounded him. They would hear about the discipline that seemed impossible to explain. Eventually, they would learn the truth. Yet the truth was never really about military service or specialized training. Those details impressed people, but they were not the lesson. The lesson was what Marcus chose to do with that experience. He carried it with humility. He carried it without arrogance. He carried it without needing anyone else's approval. As evening settled over the prison one final time, Marcus sat near the window watching the last light fade beyond the fences. Around him, conversations continued. Televisions played. Daily routines unfolded as they always had. Yet something important had changed. A housing unit that once measured strength through noise and reputation had learned a different definition. Real strength could be quiet. Real confidence could be humble. And sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the one carrying the deepest story of all. Marcus Reed never tried to become a legend inside the prison. Ironically, that was exactly why he became one.